Right now, if you wanted to know how many people die from drug overdoses in a given year, you could find an actual number within about 30 seconds. Government health agencies track it. Hospitals report it. Medical examiners categorize it. We have precise, documented, year-by-year data. Now try asking the same question about ancient Rome, or ancient Egypt, or the Han Dynasty. You'll find nothing. Not an estimate, not a rough figure, nothing. And that absence itself is the actual story of this video. Because the lack of a number doesn't mean the deaths didn't happen. It means nobody was ever counting. A quick note before we start. This video looks at the historical and archaeological records surrounding ancient substance-related mortality as a factual, academic question, not as commentary on any present-day situation. Let's start with the fundamental problem, because understanding why we can't get a real number is actually more revealing than any estimate would be. Ancient record-keeping simply wasn't built to capture this information. There was no concept of cause-of-death classification the way modern medicine has it. If someone died after using a substance, ancient observers typically had exactly one of a few available explanations: divine punishment, imbalance of bodily humors, a weak constitution, or simply unexplained death. The specific idea that a substance itself, taken in a specific quantity, directly and mechanically caused death, the entire modern concept of overdose as we understand it, essentially did not exist as a documented category of death in the ancient world, which means ancient societies weren't hiding these numbers from us. They genuinely weren't generating them in the first place because they lacked the conceptual framework to even ask the question in a form that would produce a countable answer. So if a clean number is impossible, what can we actually reconstruct? The answer comes from 3 separate sources of evidence, each one filling in a different piece of the picture, and together they paint something considerably darker than most people would assume about ancient daily life. Let's start with skeletal and toxicological evidence, because this is where modern science has actually made genuine progress reconstructing ancient death in ways that would have been impossible even a few decades ago. Advances in analyzing preserved organic material, hair, bone, mummified tissue, have allowed researchers to detect trace substances in remains that are thousands of years old. Studies on ancient Egyptian mummies have found evidence of substances including opium alkaloids preserved in tissue samples, confirming what tomb art and medical texts had already suggested, that opium use was widespread enough to leave a detectable chemical signature across a meaningful portion of the population studied. This doesn't tell us how many specific people died from opium specifically. Presence in tissue confirms use, not cause of death, but it does establish something important: the sheer scale of exposure. If a substance was common enough to show up reliably in tissue analysis across multiple unrelated individuals separated by centuries, it was common enough that some percentage of that population, using ancient dosing with zero standardization, would have crossed the threshold into fatal territory purely through the mathematics of repeated, imprecise use across a large population. This is actually the core insight that lets historians and toxicologists build rough estimates in situations like this, even without direct death records. We understand, from modern pharmacology, roughly what percentage of unsupervised, non-standardized dosing of a given substance tends to result in fatal outcomes under specific conditions: insufficient purity control, no body weight calculation, administration to vulnerable populations like infants or the already ill. Apply that known modern ratio cautiously backward onto a population we know was using the substance at meaningful scale, based on tissue evidence, medical texts, and archaeological volume of the substance found at a given site, and you can construct a defensible range, not a precise count, but a scientifically grounded estimate of plausible scale, rather than pure speculation. Now let's bring in the second source of evidence, the written medical record itself, because ancient physicians, even without our conceptual framework for overdose, still documented outcomes they clearly recognized as dangerous, even if they didn't understand the underlying mechanism. We covered this in detail in our earlier investigation into ancient overdose, but it's worth revisiting the pattern here specifically for what it tells us about scale rather than individual cases. The Ebers Papyrus in ancient Egypt, dating to roughly 1550 BC, contains explicit cautions about administering certain opium preparations to infants and to already weakened patients. Roman medical writers, including Dioscorides in the 1st century AD, documented specific warnings about mandrake and henbane preparations, causing what he described as a sleep from which the patient does not wake. Here's why this matters for our scale question specifically. A caution embedded in a widely circulated medical text isn't a record of one death. It's evidence that the underlying event, fatal reaction to standard treatment, occurred with enough frequency, across enough physicians' practices, that the pattern became recognized and worth formally warning against in writing meant to be read and used by other practitioners across an entire region. Warnings scale with frequency. You don't write a formal caution into your foundational medical reference text for something that happened once to one patient, one time in living memory. The third source of evidence is arguably the most disturbing, because it comes from outside the medical context entirely. And it's specifically about substances that weren't dangerous by accident, but were being deliberately weaponized, which tells us something about how normalized lethal dosing had already become in some ancient societies by the time we have detailed written records. We've covered Locusta, the professional poisoner active during Nero's reign in 1st century Rome, whose services were reportedly employed at the highest levels of imperial politics. Her documented existence, and the existence of an entire recognized profession around her, tells us something important for this video specifically, that by this point in Roman history, lethal dosing of common substances had become sophisticated and reliable enough to be commercially and politically viable as a service. That level of practical, working knowledge about precise lethal thresholds doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops on top of an enormous, largely undocumented foundation of accidental deaths that taught physicians, poisoners, and ordinary people alike, through repeated painful experience, exactly where those thresholds sat for dozens of common ancient substances. So let's actually try to build toward an answer, cautiously, honestly, and without pretending to more precision than the evidence supports. If we take opium alone, and we know from tissue evidence, medical texts, and sheer trade volume that it was in continuous, widespread use across Sumer, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and Rome for a documented span of roughly 4,000 years, administered without any standardized dosing, frequently to the most vulnerable members of ancient society, infants, the chronically ill, the elderly, and if we apply even a conservative estimate based on what we know about unsupervised, non-standardized opioid dosing from modern pharmacological data, the mathematics point toward a death toll across that 4,000-year span that would have to be counted, at absolute minimum, in the tens of thousands, and quite plausibly, when you factor in the sheer duration and geographic scale of use across multiple overlapping civilizations, into a much larger figure that we simply cannot pin down with any real precision. And that's just opium. Add mandrake and henbane-based Roman anesthesia, with its own documented narrow margin between effective sedation and fatal dose. Add ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, which we've covered separately on this channel, capable of killing entire villages in a single contaminated harvest season across medieval and likely earlier periods. Add mercury, used medically across multiple civilizations for roughly 2,000 continuous years, causing slow, cumulative poisoning that likely shortened enormous numbers of lives without ever being formally linked to the treatment itself. Add alcohol-related deaths, which almost certainly represent the single largest category by sheer volume of consumption alone, though ancient societies had essentially no framework for distinguishing alcohol-related death from any number of other causes. Layer all of these substances together, across every documented ancient civilization we've covered on this channel, sustained over literally thousands of years of continuous use, and you arrive at an honest, unavoidable conclusion: the actual number of ancient deaths from substance use, across all of recorded and unrecorded ancient history combined, is almost certainly a figure in the hundreds of thousands at an absolute conservative minimum, and plausibly extends into a far larger number that the surviving evidence simply cannot resolve with any more precision than that. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you more than any specific number could. Every single one of those deaths, across every civilization, across 4,000 plus years of documented substance use, happened without a name attached, without a record, without anyone at the time understanding it as part of a pattern rather than an isolated, unfortunate incident. Modern drug mortality statistics exist specifically because we eventually built the medical, legal, and administrative infrastructure required to notice, categorize, and count these deaths as a recognizable phenomenon. Ancient people were dying from exactly the same underlying mechanism: uncontrolled dosing, unpredictable purity, substances interacting with already vulnerable bodies, but they were dying invisibly, one uncounted person at a time, absorbed into the ancient world's silence around cause of death, leaving behind nothing but scattered warnings in medical texts, trace chemicals in preserved tissue, and the accumulated, hard-won knowledge that eventually taught the next several thousand years of physicians exactly how dangerous these substances actually were. So, how many ancient people died from drug use? The honest, complete answer is that we will never know the real number, and we should be deeply suspicious of anyone who claims to. What we do know, from tissue evidence, from medical warnings written into ancient texts specifically because the pattern had become impossible to ignore, and from the sheer mathematical reality of thousands of years of uncontrolled, unstandardized substance use across multiple overlapping civilizations, is that the true figure is almost certainly far larger than most people would ever assume, hidden inside a historical record that was never designed to count it, made up entirely of individual deaths that happened one at a time, in silence, long before anyone thought to start keeping score.